Hello everybody and welcome to Mishnah Mastery. So, we had a very exciting session on Tuesday night, and when we finished the session and I went back to look at the recording on YouTube, lo and behold, it hadn't captured any of the sound. Yay! So I thought that for anyone who missed Tuesday night's session, they should still be able to learn chapter 3 and chapter 4, and so I'm going to quickly try, please God, and plough through those two chapters nice and quickly because I don't have a huge amount of time, I'm sorry, but I will try and explain it as, well, at least as well as I explained it the other night, and I hope that it's some kind of compensation for anyone who didn't get to hear it. So here we go, we're going to get it up on the screen for you over here, and we're going to start with chapter 3. Now, chapter 3, we were talking about certain types of things that are prohibited, either because they are too similar to malachot, to work that you do during the week, or because they were things that could have been done before Yom Tov. So that's where the Mishnah is starting with in the beginning of chapter 3, Mishnah Aleph, first Mishnah. Ein sadin dagim min habivarim b'Yom Tov. You are not allowed to trap fish in their enclosures, in which case it would be a pond. You cannot trap fish from a fish pond on Yom Tov. Ve'ein nosnin lifneihem mazonos, and you cannot give them food. So why would you not be able to do that? Because, well, first of all, if something is not trapped before Yom Tov, you're not allowed to trap it on Yom Tov. So it's going to depend on whether they're considered trapped. So you're not going to be allowed, says the Mishnah, to trap fish from the fish ponds on Yom Tov, and you are not going to be allowed to give them food either. And the reason for that is because they can find food themselves. So there's no benefit to you being able to feed them, and so you're not allowed to do it. Continues the Mishnah, Aval tzadin chaya va'of min habivarim. But you are allowed to trap chaya and oaf, which are other types of animals and birds. You're allowed to trap those things on Yom Tov, min habivarim, if they are in their enclosures, and v'nosnin lifneihem mazonos, and you would be allowed to put food for them on Yom Tov. So as long as they were designated as food that you're planning to catch and eat on Yom Tov, and they're in their enclosures, then the Mishnah says you're allowed to do it. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, Lo kol habevarim shavim. It's not going to be the same for every single case, for every single instance. Zehaklal, this is the general rule. Kol ha-mechusa seida asur, v'she'eino mechusa seida mutar. It is going to depend on whether further trapping is required. Are these things just completely uncontrollable and you have to run around in their enclosures to be able to trap them? Or would it be quite straightforward? You've got a chicken or whatever in the enclosure and all you have to do is just reach in and grab it. If you have to go in there and still run after it, okay, if it's still lacking trapping, meaning that, or lacking control. So it might be trapped inside this enclosure, but that's not the same thing as being under your control. If you've still got to run in and chase after it, that's not going to be allowed according to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. But if it is trapped and it is controlled, then you would be able to trap it, to catch it on Yom Tov. Mishnah Beitzah talks about setting traps in the wild. Says the Mishnah, if you set trap, well, it doesn't say this, but by way of introduction at the very least, setting traps out in the wild is clearly setting a designation that whatever you catch, you're planning to eat on Yom Tov. The problem we have is, was it caught before Yom Tov or not? So it says the Mishnah, if you set traps for animals, birds, and fish before Yom Tov, lo yitol mehem b'Yom Tov, ela im ken yodea shenitzodem erev Yom Tov. You can't take them on Yom Tov unless you can be sure, unless you are certain that they were already trapped before Yom Tov started. And there was a situation with one non-Jew, Shehevi Dagin le Rabban Gamliel, that he brought fish to Rabban Gamliel, V'omar, and Rabban Gamliel said, Mutar hein, they are permissible, Ela she'ein ratzoni lekabel heimeni, but I don't particularly want to accept them from you. So, according to Rabban Gamliel, if there was even the slightest chance that they could have been caught on Yom Tov, then they're going to be okay. It's just that he wanted to rule strictly and more stringently. But fundamentally, according to Rabban Gamliel, if there was a chance that they were caught on Yom Tov, then he would say that they are permissible. Moving on to Mishnah Gimel. So, talking about a behema mesukenes, an old, sick animal, which may die. So, the problem that we have is that there could be things going on with that animal which could make the animal treifa, that it may have certain damaged organs which would make it a treifa. But the Mishnah is concerned that if we leave the animal till after Yom Tov, that it's going to have one of these simonei treifa, one of these indications of being treifa, and then you won't be able to eat it after Yom Tov. So what's the solution? Says the Mishnah, "Behema mesukenes lo yishcha." You should not slaughter an animal who is, old and in this kind of danger. However, ela im kain yesh shehus bayom le'achol memena kazai sli. Unless there's enough time before Yom Tov to eat a kazayis, an olive bulk of this animal, sali, roasted, which is the quickest way to be able to prepare it. So if you've got enough time to prepare an olive's bulk of this animal, then you can slaughter it. Rabbi Akiva says, "Afilu kazayis chai mibeis tvichasa." He's even more lenient. He says, even if there's enough time to prepare an olive's bulk of raw meat from the place where you've shechted it, then you would be allowed to slaughter it and consume it. The Mishnah continues to talk about how during the week you would carry the animal on a pole in a particular way with two people carrying it, but you have to do that with a shinui on Yom Tov. Shechata basadeh. If you've slaughtered an animal out in the field, lo yeviena b'mota v'mota, then you should not use these poles and long poles, short poles. You shouldn't carry back the animal in this way on Yom Tov. You have to do it with a shinui, with a difference. Aval mevi biyado evarim evarim, but you would be allowed to carry the limbs in your hands. That would be permitted according to the Mishnah. Moving on to Mishnah Daled. By way of introduction to Mishnah Daled, there are a couple of things that we have to kind of explain before we learn Mishnah Daled. So, most domesticated animals are considered to be prepared if they could be slaughtered. That's with regards to domesticated animals, of which Bechor is a type of domesticated animal. If you have a domesticated animal which is also a Bechor, meaning it's a firstborn animal, so a Bechor is supposed to be gifted to a Kohen. And since it's supposed to be gifted to a Kohen, it is actually not considered to be prepared before Yom Tov for your use. Now, if it develops a blemish on Yom Tov, so you're not supposed to bring a blemished Bechor to a Kohen, but you still can't kill it. Not only that, but you're supposed to slaughter a Bechor in the Beis HaMikdash. And you're supposed to, the Bechor is supposed to be eaten in Yerushalayim. If that can't happen, then you wait for it to develop a blemish, and then it can be killed and eaten by anyone outside Yerushalayim when there was no Beis HaMikdash. Now, with a Bechor, for you to know if it has a blemish or not, you had to take it to a Kohen. And the Kohen would, not to a Kohen, to an expert. And the expert would determine whether or not this Bechor was blemished or not. If the expert determined that it was blemished, so if the expert did that before Yom Tov, then you would be allowed to kill it on Yom Tov. So I hope that helps us a little bit by way of background to this Mishnah, which is dealing with an animal which is stuck in a pit and is injured. Now, if you can't eat the animal, then the animal is muktzah, and you'll have to leave it there until after Yom Tov, by which point it may have died and you can't eat it anyway. If you can eat it, then you can take it out of the hole and you can put it out of its misery on Yom Tov. So the question is, are you going to be allowed to have an expert examine this animal to see if there was a blemish on this animal from before Yom Tov? And if that's the case, then you can kill it. Or if the blemish came from when the animal fell into the pit, in which case it's a new blemish that's happened on Yom Tov, and it becomes muktzah, and it becomes forbidden. So with all that in mind, let's see if we can understand Mishnah Dalet. Says the Mishnah, B'chor shenafal labar. If you have a firstborn animal which has fallen into a pit, Rabbi Yehuda says, Yered mumcha v'yireh, that an expert is allowed to go down into the pit and examine this animal. Im yesh bo mum, if it has a blemish from before Yom Tov, ya'aleh v'yishchot, then you can take the animal out of the pit and you can slaughter it on Yom Tov. V'im lav lo yishchot. If not, you're not allowed to touch it, you have to leave it in the pit, you're not allowed to slaughter it. Rabbi Shimon says, Kol she'emuma nikam mib'od yom ein zeh min hamucham. Rabbi Shimon says, if there's no clear way of knowing for certain that the blemish, one second, I haven't been scrolling down, have I? So Rabbi Shimon says, Kol she'emuma nikam mib'od yom ein zeh min hamucham. If the blemish was not recognized from before Yom Tov, then it can't be considered prepared. And then according to Rabbi Shimon, it would seem that he is more strict, and that because you don't know for certain that it was blemished from Yom Tov, then you would not be allowed to shecht it on Yom Tov itself. Mishnah Hey. Let's scroll down. Behema Shemesa, if you have an animal who died, lo yisazenu b'mimakoma, then it is muksa, you're not allowed to move it. So if it was healthy before Yom Tov and it died on Yom Tov, you're not allowed to move it. Umaisa, and there was a situation. V'shalu es Rabbi Tarfon aleha, and they brought a question to Rabbi Tarfon on this issue, and also v'alachala shenitma'a, and also they brought him a shaila about challah, the portion of dough that would be separated and given to a kohen, shenitma'a, which became contaminated with spiritual impurity on Yom Tov. So these two things were presented as questions to Rabbi Tarfon. He went into the Beitzah Medrash to ask the question, and they said to him, both this animal which died on Yom Tov, as well as the challah which became contaminated on Yom Tov, both of these things become muktzah, and you're not allowed to move them on Yom Tov. Now, by way of introduction to Mishnah Vav, we really have to cast our minds back to the way that things worked thousands of years ago, or even hundreds of years ago, when they didn't have the same refrigeration options that we would have, right? And so it wasn't always so possible to get your meat order or whatever it might be before Yom Tov without it spoiling. So technically, the butcher would be allowed to open his store on Yom Tov, not in order to sell, but in order that people who had arranged beforehand could come and collect their meat on Yom Tov. So the Mishnah says, Ein nimnin ala behema lachatchila b'Yom Tov. You're not allowed to join a meat order, basically. They would shecht an animal once they knew that they would have customers for the animal. In order to do that, you have to build up an idea of who the customers are going to be. So you can't now start to assemble these customers so that you can go and slaughter this animal. You can't do that on Yom Tov. That's too businessy to be doing. But you would be allowed to sign up to an animal so that the butcher knows how much to charge, and he knows that he's going to have customers. So you can do that before Yom Tov, and then on Yom Tov the butcher's allowed to slaughter the animal and divide up the pieces to his customers. So even though people might owe him money, they can still take these pieces of meat on Yom Tov. Rabbi Yehuda says, Shokel Adam Basar Keneged Hakli or Keneged Hakofetz. Now fundamentally, you're not allowed to weigh anything on Yom Tov. Again, it's too weekdayish, it's too business-ish. So you're not allowed to weigh on Yom Tov. So Rabbi Yehuda says, you're allowed to take something which you know how much it weighs already, and you can use that to balance the scale. You're only not allowed to use weights. So if you have a kilo weight, which the shopkeeper uses to know how much a kilo is, you can't use that. But if you have a kilo of meat or whatever that's already been weighed out, then according to Rabbi Yehuda, you would be allowed to use that item as a counterweight so that you know what to sell. So according to Rabbi Huda, that you can take basar keneged hakli, you can weigh meat against something that you already know how much it weighs, or keneged hakofitz, or against a hatchet, again, which you already know how much it weighs. You'd be allowed to do that according to Rabbi Huda. The Chachamim say, Ein mashkichin b'chaf moznayin koleka. You can't use scales at all. Not with the regular weight, not with something that you happen to know how much it weighs. You can't do that. Your only option is to guess using your hands how much things might weigh. Mishnah Zayin deals with how to sharpen a knife on Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah, Ein mashchizin es asakin b'Yom Tov. You're not allowed to sharpen a knife on Yom Tov. Aval masiya al gabei chaverta. But you are allowed to scrape your knife against something to sharpen it. That would be okay. Lo yomar adam latavach shakol li bedina basar. You can't say to your butcher to give you a particular amount of meat. Give me a dinar's worth of meat. Can't do that. Aval shochet mechalkin b'neihem. But he may slaughter and he may share out the amount, however much it might be, and he can charge afterwards based on what he thinks that weight was. So you run the risk of maybe having to pay a bit more or the butcher losing out a little bit, but that's your only option. Mishnah Ches. We're talking about buying things on Yom Tov without transferring money or agreeing on set prices of weights. How could that be possible? Omer Adam Lechavero. You can say to your friend, to the shopkeeper, let's say, Male litli zeh. Fill up for me this vessel, but you can't be specific about how much that might be. You can't ask for a specific measurement, but you could say, fill up this particular jug. Even if you know this jug holds a liter, you'd be allowed to do that. Rabbi Yehuda says, Im hayakli shel midah lo yimalenu. If it is a measurement which is specifically used because of the size that it is, then that can't be filled up. There was a story with Abba Shaul ben Batnis, that he would fill up vessels before Yom Tov. So he would fill up liter vessels, half-liter vessels, whatever it might be. So by doing this before Yom Tov, you would know what you've got available. And so if people came and said, can I have a pint of milk, or whatever it might be, then you know what you've got. You filled up a pint before Yom Tov, and you can give those to your customers, to people on Yom Tov. So this was his way of getting around not being allowed to do this on Yom Tov. Abba Shaul says, Af b'moed oseken. You should even do this during Chol HaMoed, mipnei berurei hamidos, because this method is very honest. You're clarifying the measures, which you're not supposed to do during Chol HaMoed, apparently. So, because you've got this really honest method of doing things, you should do this during Chol HaMoed as well. The Chachamim said, Af b'chol oseken. You should do this every day. Or even, they said that Abba Shaul ben Batnis would do this every day. Mipnei mitzui hamidos. Because of mitzui hamidos, which is what is mitzui hamidos? It is by filling it up right to the top and letting everything kind of drip off, what you get left is with a very, very full jug, or whatever it might be, including the additional surface tension level at the top, which otherwise might drip off. So this way was so honest and so decent that they say about Abba Shaul ben Batnis that he actually did this every day. Continues the Mishnah to finish off the third perek. You're allowed to go to your normal shopkeeper and say to him, give me a specific amount of eggs and nuts. Because this would be the normal way of people operating at home anyway. You would count your eggs at home anyway. So it doesn't look like business if you're doing it somewhere else. And so therefore it's not going to be a problem to do on Yom Tov. Mazel tov, everybody. I'm completing the third chapter of Masechet Beitzah. Let's dive right in to the fourth chapter of Masechet Beitzah. And we're going to be continuing with malachos that you can do with a shinui and other things which are going to be muktzah. So let's have a look. What's allowed, what's not allowed? Says the Mishnah, if a person wants to be able to transport wine from place to place in a permissible way for the sake of Yom Tov, how should one do it? You shouldn't bring these things, you shouldn't carry these things in a basket or in a large basket. But he can carry them on his shoulders or in front of him. This is a shinui, this is a different way of doing it. Similarly, a person who is transporting teven, who is transporting straw or hay, straw. You shouldn't hang the kupa, the basket, over your back. But you can bring it in your hand. And you'd be allowed to start a pile of teven, perhaps one that wasn't designated for Yom Tov. It would still be allowed to be taken on Yom Tov because that is the standard usage of teven, of straw. But you wouldn't be allowed to do this with large pieces of wood which are in your backyard. You wouldn't be allowed to start using this wood on Yom Tov because large pieces of wood can also be used to sell. So if they haven't been designated for use on Yom Tov, then the Mishnah is telling us that you're not allowed to start using them on Yom Tov. So Mishnah base deals with what kind of wood is considered to be prepared for use on Yom Tov. So, ein notlin eitzim min sukkah. You're not allowed to take wood from the sukkah, even if it's not sukkos, even if it's Pesach and you are wanting to take wood from a hut. So you're not allowed to do that. Ela min hasamachla. But you would be allowed to take wood that is not from this sukkah. So if it's left lying around within a certain proximity, then you would be allowed to use that wood. You're allowed to bring wood from the field that is gathered together. So it's already gathered together. It might be typically gathered together for fires. But if it's not being used for sale, then it would be allowed to be used for your needs on Yom Tov, for firewood. And you can even take it from the karpeif, which is a type of wooded area where you would typically just go and pick it up, but it has to be close enough to you. So it could be scattered around, but it has to be within certain proximity to where you are. The Mishnah asks, Ezehu karpeif, what is this karpeif? Rabbi Yehuda says, as long as it's near to your city, as long as it's within 70 cubits of your 70 amos of your city, then you'd be allowed to go to this wooded area to collect the wood. Rabbi Yehuda says, Kol shenichnasin lo b'posachas. It has to be somewhere which you need a key to get into. So it could be more than 70 amos away, according to Rabbi Yossi. It just has to be within your tchum. Then, according to Rabbi Yossi, you'd be allowed to go all the way out there to be able to retrieve this wood for firewood, which otherwise would be muktzah. Says the Mishnah, in Mishnah Gimel, what level of preparation needs to have been done. Says the Mishnah, ein mavakin eitzim, you're not allowed to chop up wood. Lot min hakoros, not if they were beams. V'lo min hakoros shenishbara b'yom tov, and not if it was a beam that had broken on Yom Tov. So, if it was designated for building and it was not designated for firewood, you're not allowed to chop these things up. Ve'ein mavakin, you're also not allowed to use your regular tools that you would use during the week. So the Mishnah says, Ve'ein mavakin lo b'kardon, v'lo b'magera, v'lo b'magar. You're not allowed to use a hatchet, a saw, or a sickle, ela b'kofetz, but you would be allowed to use a meat cleaver. These things, that would be okay to chop up wood that you are allowed to chop up. You'd be allowed to chop it up with a meat cleaver. What if you have got a structure with produce inside the structure and it's not a cemented structure and you need to be able to remove the bricks to be able to access the produce behind it? Are you allowed to do that? Is there a malacha in removing these bricks to be able to access the produce? Says the Mishnah, Bayis shehumale peros, if you have a building a structure that is full of produce. Sasum v'nifchas, and it is sealed, but not with cement, and it bursts open, it opens up on Yom Tov. Notel memokam hapchas, and you're allowed to take produce out through the place that's opened up, through the breach. Rabbi Meir says, Af poches l'chachila v'nota. You'd even be allowed to take out these bricks and to make the breach and to make the hole. He would say you're even allowed to do that on purpose on Yom Tov. There is no prohibition, according to Rabbi Meir, of removing these bricks if there was no cement keeping them together. Says the Mishnah, keeping in mind that the way that they made lamps back then to be able to make lamps is that they would have some clay which they would make a hole in, and that would make it into a vessel, and then you'd be able to to fill that with oil, and then you'd be able to light your candle from it. So the Mishnah says, "Ein poschin es haner mipnei shehu oseh kli." You're not allowed to make these candle holders. You're not allowed to make the depression, the hole into the vessel in order to be able to make a lamp, because you're making a kli, you're making something on Yom Tov, and you can't do that. Ve'ein osim pecham b'Yom Tov, and you're not allowed to make charcoal on Yom Tov. Continues the Mishnah, ve'ein choschen es hapesila lishnoim, and you're not allowed to cut the wicks. You're not allowed to cut wicks into two. However, Rabbi Yehuda says, choscha ba'or lishtei neiros. You would be allowed to singe the middle of the wick, right? If they got a very long wick going into two lamps, so you'd be allowed to light it from the middle so that the wick severs and you're left with two wicks. You'd be allowed to do that according to Rabbi Yehuda on Yom Tov. Mishnah Hey, malachos which are forbidden, even though you are doing something else that is permissible. Let's have a look at what this is going to say. Mishnah Hey, ein shovrin es acheres. You're not allowed to break cheres. You're not allowed to break pieces of earthenware. So the reason for doing this is because you might want to make a flat surface to be able to roast something on. You're not allowed to break cheres. Ve'ein choschin es hanyar, and you're not allowed to cut up paper. Litzlos bo maliach, in order to create a flat surface to roast a salty fish. So even though you'd be allowed to roast a salty fish on or to grill, you'd be allowed to do these things on Yom Tov, but you can't break up something, rip something up in order to create the surface. Ve'in gorfin tana v'chiran. You're not allowed to rake, to sweep out the coal, the ashes, whatever it might be, inside these different types of ovens. Aval mekabshin. However, you are allowed to press the ashes down and settle the coals. Ve'ein makifin shtei chavios lishpos alein es hakadera. You're not allowed to put two jars or barrels side by side to be able to rest a saucepan or a dish on. You're not allowed to do that because that is boner, that's building. Ve'ein somchin es hakadera b'bakas. And you're not allowed to prop up a pot with a wooden wedge, which is otherwise muktzah. So you can't do that. V'chein badeles, and you can't use it to prop up a door either. Ve'ein manhigin es habehema b'makel b'Yom Tov, and you're not allowed to guide an animal with a stick on Yom Tov because it might look like you are trying to take it to market, which is going to be a problem. V'Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon matir. But Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, they would permit leading an animal on Yom Tov, and there's no concern that you're going to be thought to be taking it out to market. Mishnah Vav, can you use firewood chips for a toothpick? Says the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer says, Notel Adam Kisam Mishalafanav Lachatzos Boshinav, that you are allowed to take a small twig in order to pick your teeth with it. And you're allowed to collect wood from your courtyard to be able to light it. Because anything that's in your courtyard, according to Rabbi Eliezer, would be considered prepared. The Chachamim say, that if it hadn't been prepared, you cannot use it. And for that reason, only that which is before him. So if it was lying around in your house and you would get rid of it anyway, then you can use those things. But to go out of your way to find pieces of wood, that would not be okay if it had not been prepared for usage before Yom Tov. And finally, Mishnah Zayin, the 7th Mishnah of Perek Daled, you're not allowed to create a fire on Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah, Ein motziin esa'ur, you're not allowed to bring forth fire. Lo min ha'etzim, not using wood. V'lo min ha'avanim, and not using stones. V'lo min ha'afar, and not using dirt. V'lo min ha'mayim, and not using water. How can you create fire from water? Easy. Get yourself a glass, have a sun ray shoot through it and focus it into a particular area, and then boom, you've used water to make fire. But you can't do that on Yom Tov. And you're not allowed to heat up these grooving materials, these tiles. You can't make them red hot on Yom Tov in order to roast on top of them. Furthermore, Rabbi Eliezer said, now, I didn't really understand this when I taught it on Tuesday, and I don't really understand this now. But we're bringing another leniency of Rabbi Eliezer after he had already brought us a leniency in the previous Mishnah. So he also said, Omed Adam al hamuktzah erev Shabbos b'shviyis, that if you've got fruit which was left in a storage area, in a muktzah, right? So if you've got fruit which is typically for selling, but you want to set it aside to eat on Yom Tov, right? And also, it's Shavuos, which means that we don't need to be worried about the Teruma and Maisa, the tithing, and they're not creating a problem. So Rabbi Eliezer says, leniently, that a person can stand by his muktzah, by this storage area, on Erev Shabbos Bashvius, when it is the sabbatical year and it's Erev Shabbos, and you can say, V'omer, mikan ani ochel lamachar, from here I am going to eat tomorrow. V'chachamim omrim, but the chachamim say, ad sheyishon, it doesn't work unless you've marked out specifically v'yoma mikan v'adkan, and marked out from here to here, this area, that produce I'm going to eat from, but all the other produce has to stay and is not allowed to be eaten and consumed. So as long as you've got it, that's the main thing. If not, I apologize. But that's all we've got time for. Mazel tov, everybody, on finishing Perek Daled, on finishing the 4th chapter of Maseches Beitzah. And all being well, on Tuesday, we'll do Perek Hey, the final chapter of Maseches Beitzah, and start the next one, Maseches Rosh Hashanah, as well. In the meantime, have a wonderful and meaningful